right, we can get started. We don't need to let it count all the way down to 0. I'm already pretty late getting started today, so let's just go ahead and do it. Good morning, whoever's watching. Good to see many of you online in Discord, and view counts going up on Twitch. Sorry for getting started late. Sorry my audio. Tell me how it sounds, because it looks like there's a lot more line noise than normal on my audio, and I don't know why. So let me know if it sounds normal to you, or if it sounds about the same as, or if it sounds weird, like if you hear background noise. Well, let me kill the music. What's going on today is okay. I mean, as long as you can hear it, that's all right, and as long as the way I look isn't too distracting. Do you see the sync? Like, to me, in the preview, I see the video and audio out of sync, but maybe it's getting merged together by the time you see it. Anyway, I'm not going to worry about it. I know I have not identified the smell yet, and it's a little concerning because it's, smell is one of these amorphous kinds of things that could be lots of, very different things could smell similar, and we're trying to figure it out. It could be, because it could be like an electrical smell, like a burning smell, and that's what I'm worried about, because there's no obvious source of heat, right? There's no like space heater in this room. This is my daughter's room where we're smelling this, and the vent from the furnace seems fine, and everything just visually looks fine, but there's this like lingering smell of what could be an electrical, like a short circuit kind of thing. So I don't know. We're just gonna keep. It's one of those things we're just gonna have to keep smelling for it and see if it gets worse or better. I kind of hope it gets worse, because that would probably help us identify it. That would give us more information that we could use to get to it. Okay, so I'm gonna try something. Sometimes if I could just kind of adjust my camera a little bit, that gets the sync realigned. Sometimes it also crashes OBS, so I might not be able to. I might have to restart the stream if I end up accidentally crashing OBS. Yeah, so Lassie, that's going to be my next thing I check. I'm gonna, like, after the stream, I'm gonna just go unscrew all the plate covers and see if there's anything weird behind them. I mean, it's the kind of thing that would, I assume, leave sort of visual residue. Like, if it's enough of a short circuit to produce that much smell, then it would probably also have visual evidence, but it's not really going away. It's kind of lingering, so I'm worried that there's a continuous short happening behind the outlets, and I kind of felt them all. They didn't feel hot or anything, but it's concerning, right? You don't want things smoldering behind your walls, so I'm gonna keep an eye on that. I'll let you all know if I figure it out. It's sort of a mystery. Okay, so I'm gonna make a slight adjustment, and tell me. I know that you all don't care this much, but I'm gonna make a slight adjustment to the audio and the visual sync, and so tell me if what I did I just made a change to it, and let me know if there's a better sync between what you hear and what you see in terms of me talking. Yeah, good morning. But anyway, I'm gonna keep going and try not to look at it, so because it's distracting me. Is that better? Okay, good. All right, so today I want to talk about the material turn, and this is a big a term that refers to many different things. So I want to work through those things and explain them to you and give you some things to work with. And then, like we've been doing, I'm going to, after the lecture, I'm going to leave you with something to do on your own. And that part, I'm going to need a few minutes. Like, it's not ready yet. I need to find the PDF of the article I want you to look at, and then write some instructions. I want to make it, this will be the last reading journal kind of thing. And I want to make it something other than like read this and write about it. Like, I want to give you something to actually do. So I need to take a minute and write up some instructions. Those aren't ready yet. So I'm going to lecture now. When that's done, I'll write up those instructions, I'll investigate the smell, and then you'll work on that on your own, hopefully in coordination a little bit with your teams in Discord. So, and then that'll be the last reading journal kind of thing. No, and I will add no more tomorrow. Like, we'll be done today. All right, also things that should be done today, or hopefully are, in many cases they are. It looks like many of you have turned in the metagaming project, so that's great. If you're still working on it, that's okay too. Just bear in mind that you need to wrap that up because we need to move on to the final project. Let me see. The final project is very open-ended. I don't have anything really prepared to say about it, but let me just take a look at the assignment page and see if there's anything about it that might require articulation. Yeah, I mean, it's... Right, so it is in some ways kind of like well, it could be like some of the other projects, I suppose. I do recommend designing something and ideally creating something. I think what I'll do tomorrow, maybe if I can put it together as a recorded video, I might just do a short, I might share that today. I want to show you some options that you might not realize you have as far as making a game, actually designing something. Some of these can be very a lot more accessible than you realize until you actually try it. So maybe I'll present some options like that, so that if you're thinking about actually making a game, just a short, like a game to present an idea, then you might want to do that for your final project. So let me write that up. Otherwise, given the open-endedness of the final project description, if you've already got an idea and you're already ready to work on it, in fact, one of you's already turned it in, then by all means go ahead. It's just I recognize that assignment description is not very descriptive. It's really just sort of lots of things are possible. So I'm going to give you some more suggestions of the kinds of things that are possible, maybe later today, but probably tomorrow. And yeah, but if you have an idea, feel free to ask. I think probably the most straightforward thing that people can do and that you can see suggested there is simply a research essay. But essays can kind of be a drag to write, so I understand if you want to try something else, maybe a video essay, maybe a game design document like you did for the metagame, or maybe like if you designed a metagame, like if you just described one, maybe try to actually make it for the final project. Those are off the top of my head just examples of things people have done in the past. So if you have other ideas, feel free to run them by me. Okay, so let's get started. We've already started, but let me share some slides with you, and hopefully there's no games today, like no built-in tricks or anything with the slideshow. Well, there is a little trickiness, but not much. Basically, I'm playing with animation in a few of these slides actually, so you'll see what I mean shortly. Sure. All right. So yesterday I talked about, is that yesterday? Seems like so long ago. No. What did we do yesterday? Oh yeah, yesterday was metagaming. On Tuesday I talked about the ludology-narratology debate, which is a period in video game history, or the history of video game studies, where people were focused on different formal approaches to understanding and classifying and figuring out what kind of thing a video game is, and then taking it apart in terms of its fundamental elements, whether those fundamental elements are things like game mechanics or rules, or whether they're things like characterization and interactivity. Those are those decisions about what you think are the fundamental elements might align you with people in one of either of those camps, ludology and narratology, and to some extent that debate was kind of contrived and maybe was never really a debate, but one of the purposes it served was to help give structure to an emerging discipline. And in fact, if you look at how disciplines have emerged over time, like film studies, or comic studies, they often go through a formalist phase where there's arguments about what are we actually talking about here, and then the fields usually move on. And so what I want to present today is really the sequel to that, and metagaming I think actually maybe comes later than what I'm talking about today, but if we're going to kind of put these things in order. But after the ludology-narratology debate sort of started to fade out and people started to move on and try to focus on different questions about what we're talking about, a number of different approaches and methodologies and theories all seemed to turn their attention toward a particular orientation, a particular way of thinking about our object of study. And I like to call that the material turn, or the turn toward materialism, we might say. So let's take a look at this in slide form. The idea that we're going to be focusing on that runs through all of these different schools of thought and examples that I'm going to show you has to do with this term materiality. And this is a term that has a philosophical background. It's something that you might hear it as like materialism, and you might think of like cultural criticisms of like a materialistic culture. Maybe you've heard that kind of expression. That's not exactly what we're talking about, but materialism as a way of thinking about what matters in the world and in society. That's a thread of thought that has some echoes in like Marxism, who like Marx thought about history as dialectical materialism, and there's a little bit of that in this in what I'm talking about here. But in really just a simple expression of it, what we're talking about when we talk about materiality in the context of digital media is we're talking about the concrete thingness of digital media, or the sense in which it actually has concrete presence. Concrete is another one of these words that can be unpacked and has multifarious meanings, but I just really mean it in the simplest way here as possible, I guess. The idea that it has to do with the form, that like the material form something takes, the literal form. Another way to think of it might be we're moving from the formal to the actual. And if you think about form, like we talked about when I talk about ludology and narratology as two different kinds of formalism, that really means form essentially in the Platonic sense. Like if you know Plato's philosophies, the idea of like figuring out what things are at a metaphysical level, and like Plato asks questions like if a chair is a thing, how do we know that the thing that we're looking at is a chair? Like how do we understand an object to have a kind of identity? And he says that this is the thing that all chairs have in common is the form of chairness, that they all participate to some extent in this ideal form of chairness that we all have somewhere in our unconscious, and then we recognize each chair we see as an example of that form, a derivation of that form. So for Plato, the ideal chair or the formal chair never actually exists, because every time you create a specific chair, you're just borrowing a bit of that ideal chair's form and then using it to make your chair. I'm getting pretty abstract. There's usually a nice like way of illustrating Plato's idea of forms, and he uses the allegory of the cave. It's actually a great image, and actually you can make interesting game mechanics around that. But all that's to say that there's a line between the idea of something and the fact of something, and that's the line that we're interested in when we talk about materiality. So let's talk about this a little bit more in the context of digital media. One thing that some of the writers I'm about to talk about focus on is what they recognize as a kind of screen essentialism. And this is a term that I'm not really going to use throughout this talk, but it actually, I think it helps illustrate where we're interested in how certain theater writers, especially Catherine Hales, is interested in drawing a line between what she's trying to do and what came before. And so to her view, and in others who use this term, screen essentialism means that we are paying too much attention to what we see on the screen. We are essentializing that and pretending as though that's the only thing that matters, when in fact there's a lot else that matters. So when we talk about players experiencing the video game, and they're looking at what they see on the screen, reacting to it, and making decisions about it, and even things like metagaming, what we're doing there is we're pretending that what we see on the screen just happened to be there, and it was a necessary thing, and just was just there. Screen essentialism, in other words, has a huge blind spot in terms of what we're actually talking about and studying when we study digital media, because there's all this other stuff that happens behind the screen. So screen essentialism, I have this on the slide here, so let me go ahead and cross this out. What we're talking about as we turn towards materiality is a turn away from screen essentialism into something else. So to make this make a little bit more sense, let me proceed with a little illustration here. So if we turn the screen on its side, and this is going to help me illustrate the point hopefully, this is the kind of thing I would normally be drawing on the board with white markers, but drawing on the whiteboard with markers, but I don't have a whiteboard set up here. So I've done some slide illustrations. This is that screen, but turned slightly sideways. I discovered Google Slides doesn't have a skew transform, so I couldn't actually like rotate it in 3D. At least I couldn't find the skew transform. Maybe there is one, but I couldn't find it. So I just made a new graphic. Anyway, hopefully you see what I'm doing here. And so let's use this rotated screen to imagine the scene of play and the kinds of things that we've already talked about. So let's introduce a player. There they come. I don't know why the eyes look kind of gray. I don't know why that happened. But this is the player playing something on the screen, right? And the things that we've talked about so far really have to do with this communication between the player and the game. And we could diagram this, as we see here, in the context of just kind of sitting at the console, sitting in front of the TV. I'm standing in front of my screen usually when I'm playing. This is where we can find and talk about things like gameplay and rules and narrative and genre and reception and mechanics. That's where the player experiences mechanics. That's where they operate and interpret the thing that they're playing. This is where metagaming takes place. This is kind of the scene that we've set so far in this class as we've talked about what we've been doing. But what we do as we follow the material turn is we start looking at the other side, the things that come in behind the screen and that are there before the screen and that make the screen possible and that put the things on the screen for us to interact with. And so that means we're going to start paying attention to things like the software, the hardware, the game engines, the platforms, the storage medium, like if it's optical or flash storage, the circuitry, the literal circuitry of the system. So all of these things become available as soon as we allow ourselves to keep looking past the screen, to look deeper into the screen, and we can actually learn quite a bit. So hold on. I need to wake up this other computer here just in case. So just checking, just in case someone is chatting on the Twitch stream. I have that chat is on a different computer, so I had to keep that up there. No, so this is the diagram. Now, what we've been doing so far is we've looked at these things on the right side of the image, and whenever we try to talk about and interpret them and explain what they mean, like you all did with your close playing, this is trying to understand cultural context. Like we could think about all of these things as being informed by cultural context. For example, a narrative is going to use tropes from other things that we've already experienced. Genre is going to build on other things. Metagaming brings in our standpoint of it. Even play and rules have precedent and patterns and can be used rhetorically to make an argument in the context of culture. So culture never really gets away from those kinds of things, and I think that's pretty clear. I think the harder thing to see, but this is what we do as we follow the material turn, is to understand that these things also always have cultural context. Even the hardware, even the circuitry, even the storage medium. Sometimes that cultural context is just as simple as understanding who designed it and why. Sometimes it can be as nuanced as understanding different design choices that were based on economic conditions that led to aesthetic factors in the production of artifacts using a particular storage medium. It can get really complex, and essentially, as most people perform these kinds of analyses, we're moving left and right, we're including ideas from both sides of the screen, but it's still sometimes convenient to think of these as asking a different set of questions, and the set of questions on the left is what I'm interested in today. So these things go by many different names, and there's different theorists and schools of thought and methodologies, and these are just a few. So I think this really owes a lot. All these approaches owe a lot to Catherine Hales, and specifically she coins the phrase media-specific analysis. And what's great about that term is that it lets us build a bridge from things like textual studies to things like digital studies. And that's a really important bridge, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Matthew Kirschenbaum, he wrote a great book called Mechanisms, where he distinguishes between forensic and formal materiality. Platform studies is an idea, but it's also a book series, and it's from MIT Press, and each of those books focuses on a specific platform. Media archaeology is like a big set of things, not quite a discipline, but a set of approaches that includes lots of interesting different conversations and nuggets, and I'll show you some of those. Critical code studies is where we're looking at the code and how it's written. And then I think another big area to acknowledge in the context of the material turn is entirely different, sometimes for entirely different reasons, but plenty of people have done a lot of good work in storing, recovering, preserving video game history, and I think that is important. And a lot of the same people that study these things also do work in preservation and vice versa. So I feel like it's an important thing to acknowledge and include in this conversation. Now, one distinction that I think is a little fuzzy even among these is what is the stuff that we're talking about? Like, what is the concrete materiality that we discuss? And in fact, it can take different forms and obviously that's going to be the case. But critical code studies might be the one that is the least like the others, or it might seem that way. And that's because we're looking at software. Software, you might wonder, is software actually concrete? Is software material? Does it make sense to think of software code as having a materiality to it? That's debatable. I think smart people make arguments on both sides of that debate. I like to include it here because I think it comes up about the same time. Mark Marino coins the phrase and is really the leading thinker in this area, and he comes up with this about the same time as platform studies. So it's something that emerges alongside these other concerns with materiality. It's similar to what Kirschenbaum talks about as formal materiality, which I'll show you in a little bit. But I think it counts. I think it's part of the same conversation because we still are looking at a concretions, like a coming together into a material form to accomplish a specific purpose. Even if that's fully virtual, I think it still has the properties of materiality, like individuation, and I think it counts. So maybe this will make more sense as I get into it. I'm kind of rambling there. Okay, so let's talk about media-specific analysis. Again, this is Catherine Hales, and she, brilliant writer, very prolific philosopher essentially, and philosopher of digital media. And what she's interested in is understanding the things like specific medial affordances. And this is one of these technical words here, but an affordance just means what is allowed. Like, what does this medium that I'm using allow me to do? What does it make easy? What does it make hard? Where is the resistance in the material? And as an artist, you learn to work with a medium, and working with a medium means working with the things it lets you do and things that and not doing the things that it doesn't let you do. But it understands with kind of riding riding that friction, riding that resistance. Like in my family, we've been doing a little painting course together, like a watercolor painting, and so you have to learn like how does the paper respond to different angles of brush strokes, how does the paint respond to different amounts of water, and how does the brush take that on, and that's what we're working on right now, is just the really fundamental, like how do you put paint on paper, and that has a lot to do with what kind of paper, what kind of paint, what kind of brush, and understanding those things is what helps you start being an artist, like actually start working with that medium. But we can think of this in all kinds of other media as well. And the classic example is books, because there's the field of textual studies that really focuses on things like font choices, the weight, the color, the size of the fonts, the paper material, the page layout, variations between different printings and editions, maybe even the smell. These are things that reference the physicality of the book and that are unique properties of a book. So if we are talking about paper, the codex format, things like that books can do, we are assessing a book in terms of its bookishness. So, and this is the only book I haven't reached still, but if we're looking at a book like The Abominable Snowman, we can talk about it in terms of its dimensions, its weight, the paper. This one has a slightly ergodic element to it because we can make choices and read our way through it. But there's ways in which we can talk about the bookishness of it, the ways that this as a artifact attempts to do things that other books do, like have words printed on pages in order with a specific font at a specific size. I mean, those are all deliberate choices by an editor or a designer, and that informs how we perceive this, and writers create books with those things in mind. Some writers do that in really elaborate ways. Some view the layout as trivial, but these are choices that work in that area of physical textuality or material textuality with regard to a book. Actually, hang on a second. I can reach this one. Just thought I'd grab a few more books. I can just barely reach them from here. I don't know if I remember if I showed you these. I haven't read these books yet. This is Subcutanean. This is a book by Aaron Reed, and I say a book even though I have two of them because he's written programming that will generate a unique book every time you buy a copy. And so I don't know the exact number of possible variations, but it's apparently procedural and not random. Like it doesn't sort of just select random substitutions for certain words. It actually follows a different internal logic in terms of what's chosen to be included and not. Really fascinating artifact, but we have to think of it in terms of the materiality of it. Like understanding this kind of book from the standpoint of code, like might make sense. Like we could sort of imagine all of the possibilities, but because he chose to get it printed and I chose to buy a couple copies, I have to assess it in terms of the material specificity of this copy and look at these as individuals and as partners. Actually, the way that when you buy a pair, what he does is his code tries to generate. It has different types of pairings, but in my type of pairing, he gave me the two most different possibilities. Like these are supposed to be very far apart in terms of their identity. But it's a fascinating book, just as an artifact, right? Or you can look at. This is another kind of actually. No, it's a better example. Speaking of materiality, this is a book by Nick Montfort. He'll actually come up a little bit later in the talk today, but this is a book of computer-generated poetry, and he chose to arrange the materiality of the page such that the code is written with a black background and then white text, and then the output of that code is printed with black text and a white background. And so he is the writer of this code, and also you could say the writer of the generated text, but he's also the designer of this book, and he did these things on purpose to appeal to us as readers in specific ways, and also to reference the origins of these documents. Yeah, Kelly, I thought of that too, actually, and I thought about starting with that music video, but I figured I would get another copyright takedown mute thing on Twitch, so I didn't end up showing that. But I did, yeah, I watched that video this morning as I was getting ready for class. It's a really pretty entertaining video. I mean, there's like a storyline in it. There were back then, videos often had storylines. Anyway, so we're talking about digital media, obviously, but I thought the book, that was an interesting little journey into books. Oh yeah, the other comparison I was going to make is Travesty Generator by Liliana von Bertram. It's another book of computer-generated poetry, but she chose to emphasize different things in how she printed her code. Like she didn't do the black background thing. She printed her code kind of intermingled with the output, and it has a different effect, and I think there's a difference. A different impact. And yeah, Kelly, it is fair. I mean, like it should be fair use for me to include a short clip of something to illustrate a point, but Twitch doesn't agree, so oh well. And YouTube doesn't. Okay, so let's talk about digital media then. Like if we're looking at the same kinds of questions, the same kind of media-specific analysis, essentially, I mean, one part of what Catherine Hales is doing is simply to say like, hey, we should be paying attention to these things in ways that honor the unique affordances and properties of these things, not pretending that they are just interactive movies or something else. So in a way, she has a kind of agenda similar to a ludologist, but if we're talking about material specificity in the context of video games, we could talk about the screen size. I found this just a random picture of a Switch because you can also think about like your where your body is in relation to it, but we can also think of it in terms of like the software version, different different issues of or reissues of different consoles. Think of it in terms of the platform, like the Switch. Like what does the Switch mean as a platform? The game engine, the graphics, the video codec, even all of these are things that are specific to this experience and that could be identified and labeled and named and studied, and therefore we could talk about these as part of a media-specific analysis of video games. And even the programming too. I forgot about that one. Okay, so this is all hopefully making sense so far. If everybody's okay, do you have any questions yet? I mean, this is kind of abstract, but this is also about not abstract. Like it's also about like, instead of being abstract, like talking about metagaming, let's be very specific about these physical things. The real challenge is figuring out what to say about them and how to understand these as texts, because essentially what we're trying to do here is not just read text as alphanumeric characters that we decode into language, but we're trying to think of the text of the machinery, the text of the circuitry, to read into the circuitry meanings and values. That makes sense, Kelly. Kelly's suggesting it got its name because it can switch between console and TV. That sounds reasonable to me. I didn't think of that. I haven't got one yet, so I have not. it's one of those things where like I know they exist and they're cool and lots of people have them, but because I don't have one, whenever I hear about them, I sort of tune it out because I'm like, oh, I'll get one later, and then I'll figure these things out. But yeah, I like them. I think my kids would love it. I think the problem is one of my concerns is that they're so small and lightweight. I worry that it might be fragile, and my kids are pretty rough with things and technology in particular, and I'm a little worried about that. And I also wouldn't want to get it and like hoard it just to myself. Like I'd want to get it and share it, but I'd have to be really careful about how to do that, I suppose. We'll see. Maybe I'll do that if my dreams to acquire an RTX 3080 graphics card end up failing. Well, the controllers are, right? I mean, I feel like when I've played the controllers when they're detached, they feel really lightweight to me and fragile. Maybe it was a Switch Lite, actually. I don't know the distinction. Like I said, like any conversations about Switch, I sort of tune out. But that's a good idea, Anna. Maybe and we can work on it. So, Leslie, when you say they take a beating, do you mean that they sort of stand up to a beating? Because that's what I would worry about. Like, right? Because as you probably know, like the Nintendo 64 joystick thing takes a lot of, like, you have to crank it around a lot to play a game, but they are notoriously fragile and they break. Okay, I'll try it out. maybe I'll try it out. But like I said, my focus right now is trying to upgrade my PC, because not only can I play games on it, but hopefully it'll make some of the things I do with streaming a little bit smoother if I have a more robust CPU and GPU under the hood. Which, as it goes, I'll also have to upgrade the motherboard, and might as well get some flash memory and stuff like that too. So it's going to be a whole upgrade, but it all starts with getting a GPU. Anyway, speaking of computers, the distinction between forensic materiality and formal materiality is an interesting one and somewhat debated. I mean, not everyone follows the logic here. So the idea is that forensic materiality has to do with what most of us kind of think of as materiality, the kind of thing that we've already sort of thought about. The idea of like specificity, of individuation. These are the properties of forensic materiality. And so forensic here as a term, and this is Matthew Kirschenbaum's term, forensic here has the same context as forensic, or it has the same meaning as that word forensic in a legal context. So if you think about, like, sometimes people talk about debate as forensics, or they think about like a forensic scientist or something, like doing like on CSI. It has to do with like understanding the specific time, place, being, and uses of a specific thing, and saying that this. And when you're arguing a case in the courtroom, you're arguing about the evidence, and you're trying to say that this item was here and it means this, and that's the kind of thing that we're doing when we talk about forensic materiality in a digital studies context. It's not like there's not a question of culpability or anything like in a legal courtroom, but the same idea of like this was here and it means this thing. That's what we're doing when we talk about forensic materiality after Kirschenbaum. He makes a distinction between that and formal materiality. Some people might say that that's formal materiality is kind of an oxymoron. It's kind of what's the other thing? Like a paradox, but it makes sense to me anyway that he's talking about that same sense of specificity and individualization, but in a virtualized context, like in code. And so that's, I think, critical code studies follows the logic of formal materiality that Matthew Kirschenbaum laid out. His book called Mechanisms is excellent. He does essentially a deconstructive reading of hard drive inscription technology, and it's fascinating. So I recommend it, but it's also, it's a book, so it takes, I'm not saying you have to go read it today, but it's something that it was really, it changed my mind about a lot of things. It was really fascinating. So as an example of what he does in that book and what we can do when we start thinking about forensic materiality is, computer forensics is a thing. Like, it's a thing that people do, and recovering data from a hard drive is a thing that people do as a job. Like, either because, like, I have my family pictures on here, but the drive got corrupted. Can you help me get them off there? That's one context for digital computer forensics, one application. Another application would be like, state secrets or other things that are, in the context of espionage, right? It turns out, like, you have to work pretty hard. If you're talking about optical hard drives, you have to actually know what you're doing in order to destroy the data well enough that it can't be recovered by an expert computer forensics team. Because for one thing, you can like zoom in and literally look at the data on it. If you can zoom in far enough, it looks something like this. So you have to like wipe it or overwrite it with other data, and even then you can look at, there's always ways to do it. And this is what's fascinating about Christian Baum's book. Like, he breaks down how computer forensics works and what kinds of things they do, and it's really it's really interesting. I learned a lot. But anyway, thinking about that in other contexts, like we can think about just all of the different kinds of writing and all the different kinds of surfaces. Kirschenbaum, he's focusing on what's called grammatology. So for him, the current that he's looking through as he looks through these different kinds of media is how they have been used for writing purposes or electronic textual purposes. So he looks at all kinds of different computer storage media. This is a tape drive. This idea that they have differences that matter in terms of what you choose to store and write, I think that's important. I think that's important to acknowledge, right? And those differences might have to do with durability, or how big of an object you can put on something, or how many chunks you have to break something in to put it on multiple things. Like, all those are just sort of practical decisions that we would make as we chose what kind of storage medium is appropriate for whatever we're trying to store. But people's ideas about these different media change over time. There's the sort of nostalgic appeal of vinyl audio, like people playing records. There's not as much appeal or interest in vinyl video, but it exists. Like, there's actually a video format that can be recorded on vinyl, like plastic. And so, like, what's that about? It's a very different way of thinking about video content, but you can actually play it on something that looks like a record player. A video disc player. They have one at Reclaim Arcade, actually, or they had two. I think one broke, and so they bought another one. But it's the video disc format is fascinating because it looks like a laser disc, and you think, oh, it's like a laser disc. Laser discs were kind of the precursor to DVDs, but it actually is vinyl. Like, it's literally plastic with a groove in it. Actually, several grooves that run parallel, I think. But anyway, point is, storage media is weird and interesting. All right, so thinking about specificity and material specificity also can get us into a different sense of forensics. So usually when I talk about this in class, I like to bring out my actual Game Boy, and it is currently in my office, so I was not able to do that. I also was not able to find a picture of it, but I do have several pictures of it. This is not it. This is someone else's Game Boy that I just found online, but this one actually demonstrates the same thing. When we look at forensic materiality, we're thinking of forensic materiality, we can identify all kinds of specificity. And what I like to do, what I'm interested in, is understanding forensic specificity down to the individual objects. So it's not just understanding where does the Game Boy come from as a medium or the platform, but where does this Game Boy come from? And what do the physical traces of that origin tell us about that origin? And one thing that's really cool that you can see on actually a lot of these, and so that's why it was relatively easy to find an image like this, is if you look closely on it, if you zoom in a bit, you can actually see someone's fingerprint on this. And on mine, the fingerprint is much more, it has several fingerprints. They're much easier to see than this particular example. But what we can see there is someone who was working on this left a trace of their body on this, like a trace of their physical being on this digital artifact. And so it's a really vivid reminder, I think, that this is a physical object, a material object. The Game Boy is not just sort of a form that things take on in order to be the games that we experience through it, but it's this physical thing that has this history. And that history extends into the materiality of its assembly, which means that we should be paying attention to like the life and the body of that person that made this thing. Like, who was that person? Who were they? Probably who was she, right? Because electronic assembly work, it has historically been predominantly women doing this work. So like doing the physical, like putting things together, factory work, right? Like, who was that? What was their life like? Or what is it like if they're still like, these are things we can never know, but we can start to imagine because we can see the trace of their body here. That kind of thing is something I do in my Digital Studies 101 class, by the way. I think, so let's see, a couple of you took that class. I'm kind of looking through the list of people who are online right now. But in my 101 class, we do a digital archaeology project where we try to understand these kinds of things. And the basis of that really comes from Matt Kirschenbaum's idea of forensic materiality. So anyway, this is a Game Boy. I think they're fascinating little artifacts. Yeah, right on, Maddie. So yes, it's not. It is copper. It's the shielding for the back of the printed circuit board of a Game Boy. I'm not sure actually what's being shielded from what, but it has to do with that. So it's a little copper plate. Really a surprising amount of copper actually in that device. A lot of times those shields are going to be just steel. I'm not sure why this one was copper, but that's the kind of question that I should learn about. Like that would be good to know in the context of digital materiality. Like why is there copper there? Right, because copper is really conductive. So I don't know. Maybe it's actually doing more than shielding. I don't know. Okay, so this is actually, I don't actually have, I was not able to find or get everything together for this, so I can just sort of briefly explain another example of thinking about the implications of forensic materiality. So Lisa Nakamura is a researcher. I gave you an essay from her earlier on about digital race and identity tourism. But some research she did actually uncovered something really interesting about Fairchild. Fairchild Semiconductor was, or I guess I don't know if they still exist actually, but they produced the Fairchild, the Channel F console that I showed you the other day that I was able to plug in and play with my daughters. That Channel F console has inside of it an F8 integrated circuit, a chip, a microchip, one of the early microchips, general purpose microchips. And those devices were for a while made at a plant in Shiprock, New Mexico, on a Navajo reservation. And so when we look at, again, the specifics of a device, understanding the labor that went into producing it is important. And the Shiprock example is really important to know about because of how it indicated both the gendered nature of digital labor and the racialization of digital labor, and that's Lisa Nakamura's analysis of it. So what she uncovers is essentially corporate documents from Fairchild talking about and promoting this plant that they installed on, that they worked out this deal with the Navajo, where the Navajo were going to get to work in the electronics industry, and it's going to be great for them, and it's also going to be great for Fairchild because they'll get this cheaper labor. And for Fairchild, one of the things they did to, as an example of the racialization of labor, in this example anyway, they talked about the idea that Navajo women, because they are good at weaving, like they weave intricate rug patterns, they have they inherently have the sort of dexterity and ability to focus on small things that's important if you're soldering together circuit boards and microchips. So for them, so the idea that they've got this sort of racial advantage at this kind of work feels a little icky. It feels a little weird, but I mean that was kind of the premise. There's a whole story about that plant and sort of what went wrong with it and everything afterward. There was labor protests around it. The building exists. You can find it on Google Maps. They shut it down after a while and shipped things away from there. But it's part of an interesting period in the computer industry where we tend to think of cheap labor for producing electronics as a consequence of globalization. So we think of like Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, Philippines, places like that where that is where currently lots of our electronics are made. And that has to do with all kinds of things about tariffs and labor costs and so on. That's a whole conversation. But for a while anyway, it was cheaper to find labor sources in the United States, so you didn't have to think about shipping and exporting and importing and kind of things. So there are different pockets where different manufacturers like Atari and Fairchild and Magnavox, they would have their things made. So Shiprock was one of those. Blanking of the city, the place near where the Atari landfill is. I'm blanking on the name of the city there, but it's generally the same region, sort of. In the region of Los Angeles. I'm blanking on what it's called. But anyway, there was also another interesting pockets like that in East Tennessee where I grew up. So that's a labored history of digital media that I would like to learn more about, honestly. So maybe I will. But that's all I had to say. I don't have a good slide, but this is an image of a rug that was included in the brochure the corporate brochure announcing and advertising this shiprock plant, and kind of offered as evidence of how what the Navajo women are already doing is kind of like what we want them to do for our company. Anyway, so moving on a bit, this is platform studies. So platform studies is kind of a, you almost could say a brand of it's sort of a brand or maybe a franchise approach to understanding the materiality of platforms. So a key definition here is what do we mean by platform? And this image that you see here, this graphic, appears on the website, platformstudies.com, and the Platform Studies is a book series by the MIT Press. So the website is really just meant to explain the book series. And this is a way that the editors of that series and the authors of the first book in that series, Ian Bogost and Nick Montfort, try to understand what they're talking about. So we've heard about Ian Bogost before. He shows up in quite a number of ways in this class, it turns out. He came up with the idea of procedural rhetoric. He's a columnist now, or I don't know his actual title, maybe editor at large. He works for The Atlantic magazine now, and teaches at Georgia Tech. Nick Montfort, he's also a digital. I mostly interact with Nick in the context of digital poetry, and he's the author of this book. But that's something else he does. But they also created this book series and wrote the first book in the series about the Atari. But basically the idea is the platform is that thing behind the code. Like it's the thing that the code is written to run on. And that thing could have different forms. Often we conventionally will just associate that with a physical platform like an Atari 2600 as like a specific thing. But it could also be a virtual platform like Flash. The Flash, the software that runs Flash games. Like that is a platform as well. It's a platform that we've all become a little bit more familiar with, perhaps because you probably your browser, your computer probably told you recently to disable it. So it's something that we had an unusual relationship somewhat recently. But platform studies, yeah. So it's a book series, and I just thought I'd put some covers on here to show you the kinds of things people write about in the book series. I've read most of these. So Future is Here is about the Commodore Amiga, Codename Revolution is about the Nintendo Wii, Racing the Beam is about the Atari VCS, or also known as the Atari 2600. There's the book about Flash by Anastasia Salter and John Murray. There's a book about the Nintendo. There's a book about the Minitel. I don't actually know that one as well. Something about BBC Micro. Another one about Super Nintendo, and this one, the one that's called Peripheral Vision. It's about it's like I don't know what the device is actually used for, but it's like it's a plotter device of some sort used by the Air Force for something. But people like what's his name? Whitney. Is it John Whitney, I think, was able to use these things to create digital animation very early on, so like 1960s, 50s even, digital animation. So this is a book about that technology that does those things. So within these books, each of these authors chooses a particular platform and then writes a book about it. Those approaches will vary, but a lot of times they are focused on how is this platform used to produce things that are meaningful? And so they often come from a background in literary or digital or textual studies. That's what Stephen Jones comes from when he writes about the Nintendo Wii. And he talks about the space of play, and he talks about the text of the game and the text of the platform as being the space that you play in. And so he takes an approach that focuses on that. Jimmy Meyer in The Future Is Here with the Commodore Amiga takes a much more technical approach and really digs into what makes the Commodore Amiga really fundamentally different from every other like home computer system, and he does that basically to explain why that computer still kind of has a cult following even today. So it's a interesting and slightly different approach, but definitely more, I guess, historically focused. The Super Nintendo, that book has more to do with talks more a bit about the corporate idea of the Super Nintendo and kind of the marketing around it and its existence in as an object. Anyway, lots to talk about. But I want to wrap things up somewhat soonish, so just a few more slides to get through here. Media archaeology. So this one is the most diffuse of these different things, not even really a methodology so much as a way of characterizing a number of different conversations around media that have a few things in common, but not very many. But one way of thinking about the kind of thing media archaeology does is something that I did the first or second day of this class, when I talked about video game generations, I was trying to explain and trying to talk about generations, but trying to undermine that a little bit, to try to get away from the teleological sense of that. Teleology is the study of consequences and how ends are arrived at through different means and causes. So media archaeology is the conversation around a different way of thinking about and ordering things. So if we think about the so Kelly just shared a GIF of a trowel that says "Let's dig again." Sometimes media archaeology is kind of literally digging, like literally, but the imagery of an archaeologist like digging down in the dirt, pulling up something, and then trying to explain what it means or what it meant, and try to understand how it got there, that kind of thing. That's essentially what we're doing, but we're just doing it with contemporary things where we don't usually have to dig them up out of the ground, except for the Atari landfill. But in media an archaeologist is interested in things like context and influence and culture, and we can have those kinds of conversations and interpretations about anything, even contemporary things. Oftentimes, a media archaeologist will take a divergent point of view. They'll take almost a backwards or a counterintuitive approach to studying something. So instead of thinking so if you look at the dots here as that are going along here as line, if you think of those as platforms in a sequence of generations, like, right, I mean, if you think of the generational model of video game history, first gen, second gen, third gen, fourth, and so on, that's kind of the linear model that I was trying to get us away from. And that line there, that's what that signifies. A media archaeologist might be interested in not understanding, in thinking away from that sense of logical progression, like the sense of the sense of determinism, the sense that this thing obviously leads to the next one, obviously leads to the next one, and so on. Instead, they want to understand things that are in the neighborhood, and things that are around those other things. And that neighborhood, we can find that neighborhood if we start thinking of different lines of influence, different lines of connection, different alternative histories, even speculative histories, or things that haven't happened yet, or things that might have happened. So, for example, like if we think of the Channel F, which is, as I showed you, that was the first home game console that had video games stored as ROMs, as software on a cartridge that you stuck into it and played it. It was competing directly with the Atari 2600 that came out. The 2600 came out later in the same year, 1977. It came out at the end of 1976, but really popular in 1977. Like, if we view that moment, this is an oversimplification, but if we view that generation as initially a competition between Atari and Channel F, clearly Atari won, but what if they didn't? What if they hadn't? What if Channel F had won and there were 27 million Channel Fs instead of 27 million Atari 2600s? And that really is about how many there are, Atari 2600s. They kept making them until the 90s. What if? Like, what are the things that we take for granted about video game history because of that particular console, and how might we imagine things to be different? And how could those differences and our imaginations of those differences help us understand what we actually ended up with? And I think we can learn a lot if we take those kinds of approaches. Or, like, what if the Vectrix was the dominant console of that generation, or in television? And we can look at reasons why they weren't, but the media archaeologist is more interested in asking the what if question, not the why not question. If that makes sense. At least I am. At least that's kind of how I approach it. Okay, so critical code studies is another approach, and this is an example that I pulled out that I hope illustrates what we're doing when we do critical code studies. We are interested in understanding what the writing of the code tells us. So if you think back to my initial, behind the screen diagram, this is where we're viewing the code as the text. So we're not just viewing the game that you play as the thing that's available for interpretation, but the code that produces the game is also a place where we can interpret things. Sometimes that means interpreting or theorizing about intentions of the writers, or their assumptions, or their goals, and sometimes that means kind of contrasting what the game experience is actually like versus what it seems like it was supposed to be like based on the code. And this sometimes it just means understanding and finding new contexts. So this is a bit from an essay, or I think it was originally a conference paper by Mark Sample. He wrote this. This is like 2010, I think. This is the criminal code, the procedural logic of crime in video games. The whole piece has to do with how crime works in SimCity. Specifically, actually, he's looking at Micropolis, which was like the open source version of SimCity. And in that code, what's interesting is this is actually sort of a side point in his argument, but I think it's a good illustration to pull out. Is like understanding why certain things that appear random in the game happen and how often they are supposed to happen. As a player, this kind of information could be useful if you have certain goals you want to try to achieve, like speedrunners. If they can access the source code of a game, they might find a way to exploit part of it. But just for a critic, this tells us a lot about the ideas around this particular game. And I don't know if you know, you may not be able to read the code here. That's fine if not. But what's basically happening is a random, I wish I could highlight it. I don't know if this cursor is actually lined up the right way, but where it says switch get random 8, that's basically saying roll the dice, imagine an 8-sided die and roll it, and then I'll give you a number. If that number is 0, nothing's going to happen. If it's number 1, if you roll a 1, it's going to be cause a fire to break out. And then the 2 slashes there, whoever wrote this code wrote those 2 slashes to leave a comment for themselves or an explanation saying that means there's a 2 out of 9 chance that a fire is going to break out. So that just happens if you roll a 1. If you roll a 2, nothing happens. If you roll a 3, then then a flood is going to happen. And so that upshot is that that's a 2 out of 9 chance that there's going to be a flood. And then if it rolls a 4, originally that would have called a function that allows an airplane to crash into your city, into SimCity. But what this code here, the comment here is revealing is that the programmer who made this source code open source, like the programmer who took EA's original code and then made it publicly available, left this explanation to say that there used to be a 1 out of 9 chance of an airplane crash, but there no longer is after 9/11. So 9/11 is a cultural event, a thing that we all know, and I think it's something that you can imagine being sort of traumatic and disturbing to appear in a video game, an airplane crashing into a building. So EA requested that it be removed from the game code before the game was made open source. And that's where it was. So you can still, like, the same thing happens, like in terms of rolling an 8-sided, or I guess it's actually a 9-sided 9-sided die, but the function call that would have been like make airplane crash or whatever is no longer there. Like it no longer happens if you roll a 4 in that situation. So that's an example that we can learn the whole story behind that by looking at the code of this and trying to understand it. It's both reading this message that was left for us, but also understanding the behavior of that code in that moment. That's what critical code studies requires. All right, so video game history and preservation. This kind of is the last, I think this is almost the last slide. I just have some links to different places and organizations that do this. This is the Media Archaeology Lab, and this is a organization and a location created by Laurie Emerson. And they've just made a new website. So I'm just kind of curious to see what they have here. Oh, they have Wing Commander. Okay. They don't have a picture of it though. But they have lots of out-of-date, interesting, old, broken, quirky hardware. Like that's one of the things that they specialize in. And what is this? So they have like the Amstrad GX 4000 looks like sort of a failed 3rd gen console kind of thing. Oh, they have 3D picture. Cool. Oh, that's cool. This is a new thing on their website. So it looks like, just a game console that you may not have ever heard of, but it exists and now they have one. So if you want to study it, you can go to Colorado and look at these. They really were the inspiration for what became the console living room at UMW on the 4th floor of the Convergence Center. We call it the console living room. I have a link here to another thing that is more important than what we did, also called the console living room. We kind of accidentally named our thing the same thing. But their thing has to do with software preservation, and this is archive.org, the Internet Archive Organization, and I've given you links to this before, but this is, here's the Amstrad GX 4000 right here. This is a place where we can experience the software that existed for this console, including Burnin' Rubber, which was the one that actually Is that what's in there? I think that's actually what's in there. This is an emulator. It's a web-based emulator. It lets you experience the software. It's not a perfect 100% recreation of what you would have experienced if you owned one of these and you sat down in front of your TV and played it, obviously, but it still gives us access to the content in a way that's really important. And this is, an important aspect of, of history, of preservation. Like, this is a console I don't know very much about at all, so I don't really know what I'm gonna get if it works. But I'm kind of curious to see what it looks like, at least. Okay, where are my actual controls? Okay, I don't want to deal with that right now, but you get the point, right? I mean, emulation is an important thing, and the console living room is an excellent emulation initiative. There are others, and most in ROMs and emulators circulated for years illegally, and essentially they are illegal, but thanks to some provisions in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, accessing and creating software to access things that are no longer published can be allowed under in the interest of history and preservation. I haven't checked recently, but there was a big ROM site that you could get hundreds of ROMs from and then play in your arcade emulator or whatever. And it disappeared, or it deleted all the ROMs because it's a copyright violation to distribute them. So last I checked, they were still gone, but I actually have them all. So if you are looking for a specific arcade game ROM and you can't find it emulated on archive.org, I probably have it. So just let me know. Reclaim Arcade, of course, we heard from Tim and Jim a few weeks ago now, or 2 weeks ago. I just think it's another great example of the kind of work being done for video game preservation. I mean, obviously, this is also a business for them. They want to make money, and people, they want people to pay them to access their stuff. But what they're doing is also really important as a kind of preservation of cultural heritage, and that's a great way to experience it. Of course, is in an environment that, in some ways, emulates the original environment, in addition to the content of that environment being the same, like with the arcade games. So yeah. Looking forward still to going. Let's see. What's their countdown? 7 days. 7 days to go. All right. So the Computer History Museum is also another important venue. This is out at Stanford, and it's not just video game history, but lots of other things. I should have mentioned there are quite a few other video game museums. I don't have links to them, but like the Strong Museum of Play up in New York has one. Stony Brook has one. What is it? Is it Arizona or Arizona State? I always get those confused. But one of those has the one that they let you, if you're a researcher, you can actually borrow material from them. So I borrowed their Virtual Boy once. They just mailed it to me, and then I played with it for a while and mailed it back. Preserving virtual words was another relevant and interesting initiative. The work here was trying to understand how we can think about preservation for things that are sort of inherently diffuse and incredibly large when you think about them. So how would you preserve World of Warcraft, right? So if you can think about how do you preserve adventure? Well, one straightforward thing you can do with adventure is make a copy of the ROM, a binary image of the data on the ROM, and then you've got it. But how do you make a copy of World of Warcraft if what you mean by World of Warcraft is every version of it, every player's interactions with it, all the stuff that happens because it's generated, based on interactions and what happens in the world? It's an enormous undertaking. And so preserving virtual worlds was an initiative to try to figure out how to do that. And they came up with basically some suggestions. That's right, Sherry. So Meg points out and Ryan also, that is allowed under the DMCA. So a lot of times when you go to websites that do let you download these things, they'll have some kind of disclaimer saying only download this if you also already have a physical copy of it. So technically, to have an emulator that runs and run a ROM of Pac-Man, you actually are supposed to legally own the board for Pac-Man, the actual ROM of that's in that arcade cabinet. If not necessarily the whole cabinet, but at least the board of it. For the purposes of study and academic things, I take a pretty, liberal interpretation of fair use and allow myself to access these things for the purpose of research. It's not like I'm selling a product based on it, and I I want to understand and learn about these things so I can teach people about them. So I have lots of ROMs, is what I'm saying. I actually use those to make, since I showed you all a Twitter bot yesterday, this is one of my earlier Twitter bots called ROM Text, and it searches through game ROMs and attempts to extract strings of text, and then it tweets them out when it finds them. And sometimes it's pretty entertaining. I can grant you no credit. Lord, I must remind you that you have no troops. Great. I don't know what the game that's from, but this uses the naming schema from MAME, the Multi-Arcade Machine Emulator project. And so this uses that software to classify the ROMs. But the code I wrote, what it does is it goes through and it looks through, goes bit by bit, or character by character, or byte by byte, whatever is available through the game ROM, and tries to locate contiguous groups of values that might be alphabetic signifiers, and then it tries to interpolate those into an alphabet, and then it prints it out if it turns out to actually pass a spell check, basically. And I had to do it that way because a lot of those games don't have ASCII text. Like normally in computers, you type an A, the byte that's stored is a specific number in the computer that always equals A. I think it's 42 off the top of my head. It's probably wrong, but it's, that's how ASCII, that's the convention of ASCII text. A lot of game ROMs don't follow ASCII conventions, so you have to do some educated guesswork or write code that does educated guesswork to try to find text in them. And so that's what I did, and it tweets it out. Often pretty funny. Often it will actually be text, and a lot of times it'll just be things that were just false positives. And I think those are also really entertaining and interesting to look at as a kind of visual poetry. So yeah, that was my code. This is a kind of digital creative project based on forensic materiality, or formal materiality, I guess. Okay, so a couple of things I do want you to look at, and instructions and links are going to be forthcoming. I want to I need to find the PDF for that first one by Hutamo, and then I need to take a look at the combat and context essay. It's kind of long, I think. It's been many years since I've read it, but I think it basically lays out the argument for platform studies and demonstrates how to do platform studies on the cartridge for combat, which is the when you bought the Atari 2600, it was often packaged with the combat cartridge. So many people had it. I need to kind of look at that and see if I want you to read the whole thing, or if it's necessary to read the whole thing, and then give you some instructions for something to do with it besides just read it and then respond to it. I want to come up with something more involved in that. So give me a little time to work on that. I'll put some instructions up in Canvas and send you some notification in Discord once that's ready for you to look at. It'll be something you do on your own sometime the rest of the day. And then do that sometime by tomorrow, I guess, is the idea. But instructions and links forthcoming. Okay, so everybody doing okay? Looks like many people, you're all still watching, so I guess you kind of went with me on that. I really blitzed through a lot in that talk, so if you have any questions about it, any particular part of it, let me know. But hopefully you see, hopefully what you get from this is that there are lots of different ways to talk about video games and try to understand them. And a lot of those differences have to do with the formal specificity of and the individuality of these as systems. So good. And we can. I don't have anything planned to talk about right now, but I plan to talk about it some tomorrow if that's all right. I know that's pretty much the last day of class, but it's the final project, so maybe that makes sense. And okay. Ryan reacted with the fork and knife emoji. I don't know what that means. Okay, so take a look at the assignment description. It's very open-ended, so maybe what I can do is give you some examples. But basically, let me look at it real quick and see if there's anything I can clarify about it verbally. It really has, it's conceptually, it does need to be similar to a paper. If you think about what a paper is, it's not just a bunch of words, right? If you write a paper for a class, you have some kind of argument or some kind of question that you're trying to explore and answer. I want you to do something like that. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to explore it in a paper. You could explore it in a game design or a video or something else. But I want there to be a specific question you're trying to answer, or at least like either answer it definitively if you can, or maybe propose a possible answer. That's the kind of thing that will be a good starting point. These you can work in a group if it's helpful to do that. If you do make that, you will also need to you will both be responsible for submitting separate reflection statements or artist statements explaining why you did what you did. But yeah, maybe what I'll do is come up with some sample questions that might be easier to think about than thinking about differences in artifacts. Okay, well, hopefully that's all right. I'm going to wrap things up so I can go drink some tea and investigate the weird smell in my house some more and hopefully figure it out. I did check. I have smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, and they're all fine. They say there's nothing, but I'm still worried about it possibly being something electrical. So I'm going to go find out, hopefully. All right, everyone. So I'm going to wrap up the stream. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow. One more stream tomorrow. I'm not going to do any more today, so there will be one final stream tomorrow, and that'll end, I guess, my part of the class, but you may still have some work that you're finishing up over the weekend. All right, so I'll see you later. Bye.